Hey, what's up YouTube? Today I'm going to talk about stylized grass, and oh boy, there's a lot to say. This is a huge topic, right? There are a million ways to do it, just like there are a million of videos on the subject already, whether it be for Unity, Unreal Engine or any other game engine. And really there's no right or wrong way to do stylized grass, or any kind of grass really. It mostly comes down to, I'd say, art direction and technical constraint maybe. Artistically, there are a lot of variables you can play with. How cartoony should it look? Should it be subtle and blend with the environment or stand out? How should it react to lighting? Should it catch shadows? The look of individual grass blades, right? Thick, thin, curved, straight, dense, sparse, you name it. Lots of things to try here. How should it move with the wind and so on and so forth. And ideally, you should always take into consideration the in-game camera distance and angle at which your grass is most often going to be seen when figuring out all that. But anyway, the list goes on and on, right? So there's definitely quite a lot of artistic freedom involved in the process. You can really go wild and come up with quite a unique way to make stylized grass. So in this video, once again, I'm by no means going to say, hey, you should do this or that. I'm just going to share my workflow and also tons of cool tricks along the way to hopefully give you ideas on how to push your stylized grass to the next level. Now, artistic freedom is one thing, but we're talking about game dev here, so there are obviously technical constraints at play, and stylized grass is no exception. Grass can be extremely expensive to render. And there's a simple reason for that. You usually see a ton of grass in games, and from very far away as well. So the vertex count, for instance, can skyrocket quite quickly, and no, still to this day, vertices aren't free. Sure, there's nanite and similar rendering tech out there, but they come with their own set of constraints and do come at a cost still. I'll let you take a peek at this article to know more if you haven't already. So yeah, nanite is definitely at a point where it's beginning to be quite a viable option to render foliage and tons of grass on most hardware, but I feel like it's still a bit early to entirely discard old school techniques. Plus, many of the techniques I'm going to show are probably applicable regardless of the rendering method you choose. So before you ask, nope, I'm not using nanite in this scene, but it's a solution worth investigating for sure if you can afford it. The computer I daily drive barely runs UE5, so that's not really an option for me, but I guess it has its benefits as well. It's much easier to identify bottlenecks on a potato computer and to focus on performance, which is also going to be a huge topic in today's video. Anyway, grass is expensive to render and can be tricky to stylize, so in this video I'm first going to briefly show my overall workflow using Blender. Now that first part is going to share quite a few similarities with my stylized trees video, where I showcased a similar workflow, so make sure to give that video a watch as well. Then I'm going to show a bunch of techniques that you can use to push your stylized grass to the next level and optimize it as much as possible. Okay, lots of things to talk about, so let's jump right into it. Alright, I usually start by modeling a couple of grass blades using very simple meshes and figuring out the overall style. I toy with pointiness, curvature, thickness, density and so on. If you're familiar with the 3D software of your choice, modeling that kind of meshes shouldn't cause any issue. The challenge is mostly artistic at this point. It's all about creating interesting shapes that read well up close and at a distance. Using a 3D software to create foliage textures is a workflow I really like because it lets me bake all kind of maps very easily. Sure, it's a bit harder to achieve a painterly look if that's what you're looking for, but it has its benefits. For instance, those meshes are carefully unwrapped, so I can use that UV map to derive gradients using a simple material and create all kind of useful maps, but more on that in a minute. I use a top-down orthographic camera to have a canvas to work with, right? That way I can lay my meshes within that render region and just press render to create my textures. Okay, once I'm happy with how the grass looks, I create the grass cards. But first I ensure I can create the most simplest cards for higher LODs, so those meshes need to be somewhat spaced out to allow that. Here I chose to create two LODs, so that's LOD 2, 1 and 0. Using automated tools to create LODs, like Unreal Engine offers, can lead to quite a few issues with meshes entirely based on cards, so I usually prefer creating LODs manually for foliage assets to have complete control over the process, and LODs are always super important to maintain decent performance. Now, performance is a complicated topic, right? Because it's somewhat subjective and highly dependent on a large number of variables, so there's most often not one single right answer. You might think a specific way of doing things is the most performant way, until you stumble onto an edge case in which it's not anymore. For instance, transparency has a bad reputation, and rightfully so. Overdraw is most often a big concern, and so it's usually considered best practice to add at least a few vertices here and there to detour those meshes and cut out transparency as much as possible. It's even possible in some cases that the most performant solution is to skip using transparency entirely and purely rely on geometry, but that's highly dependent on a large number of factors, so mileage may vary. There's pretty much always a tipping point though, because again, most often there's a huge number of grass meshes instantiated and rendered, right? So the vertex count can skyrocket quite quickly, and avoiding transparency entirely, but throwing hundreds of thousands, if not millions of vertices at your GPU isn't necessarily more performant. Obviously, with nanite it's much less of an issue, but you might have your reasons not to use it, like supporting older hardware for one, and again it has its own set of constraints. Anyways, there's a lot at play when we speak of performance on grass. For instance, very small triangles at a distance can cause issues with quad overdraw. A depth prepass can also greatly mitigate the cost of using masked opacity, but that pass comes at a cost on its own. Also, grass materials usually have a complex vertex shader, to create wind animation for instance, so that vertex shader cost also naturally increases with the amount of vertices to process, and so vertex processing can become a bottleneck. So there's no right or wrong answer here. I usually find that up close you can definitely afford some geometry to reduce overdraw as efficiently as possible, but then it's best to lower that vertex count quite drastically at a distance and rely on transparency more. But you might prove me wrong, and that's precisely my point. It's really a matter of figuring out where that tipping point is and finding the right balance between transparency and geometry. So I can only recommend you to profile, do benchmarks on your own, and see what gives you the best result with your typical in-game view distance, targeted hardware and all that. Anyway, enough technical jibber jabber. Once I have my flat cards modeled, I unwrap them. To do that, using a simple quad that matches the render region, I can just select everything and use the project from view bounds option, and boom, done. Then I duplicate those cards, reset their pivot point, orientation and scale. I also tweak them a bit so they aren't just flat cards. Creating cards that can be seen from most point of views, at least partially, is greatly going to increase the perceived grass density and will make it way more interesting to look at up close. Then I duplicate those cards to create a grass mesh. Here again, there are things to try performance-wise. You see, this grass mesh is going to be instantiated in-engine a huge number of times, right? And so you might want to try having a more compact grass mesh with fewer cards and fewer triangles, and spawning a larger number of instances in-engine, or try using a bigger mesh but fewer instances. There's probably a sweet spot to find. Anyway, once I'm done with that mesh, I usually like to bake pivots, especially for grass where the Z component is irrelevant because all pivots are pretty much at 0 in Z anyway, so you only really need to bake pivots in X and Y, and thus you only really need one extra UV map, so the memory cost is pretty much null, and the things you can do in-engine with pivots is quite insane, so it's a win-win. If you're not familiar with the idea of baking pivots or any kind of data into UVs, I'll let you watch my video dedicated to that. Also, on top of pivots, I like to bake a normalized top-down gradient in Y in an extra UV map, that's always super useful, and I also usually bake a pseudo-random 0 to 1 value in X per grass card. That let me randomize some things in engine per card, like offset the wind animation, but more on that later. If you do that though, you must make sure all LODs share that same value, right? Now, it's always a great idea to mess with normals when it comes to foliage, especially when it's stylized in some way, but here I actually don't care. I will handle normals in the shader directly in engine so they can remain unmodified. And voila, that grass mesh and its LODs are ready to be exported. However, I actually didn't render any texture yet, so let's do that real quick. A simple white material will do just fine for the opacity. I can use world normals remap like so to render a normal map. Then, using texture coordinates, I can render a root to tip gradient and an edge gradient. Then I can also render a random grayscale value per grass blade, a height map, possibly, why not, and then combine all those maps into RGB mask textures. Using those gradients and masks, I then can create cheap specular and roughness textures, just to highlight that center line a bit. For the color, I'm actually not going to use a texture per se. Well, I'm going to use one, but it's what I call a splat map, that I'm going to project over the world across a large distance to create patterns of varying colors and add a bit of randomness to the landscape. To create that splat map, I personally like to use Krita because it has some cool painterly looking brushes, and its warp mode let me create tiling textures super easily. And really here it's just a matter of using the right colors, brushes and values to create some painterly looking patterns. Cool, finally I also render a sort of distance fill texture, which can come handy, I'll explain why in a minute. Essentially this is a bidirectional gradient, meaning it not only goes from that center line to the edges, but also from root to tip. And to create it, I duplicate those meshes, flatten them, and using the shear tool, I can create a slope on that center line, and voila, there's a slope from root to tip, but also a slope from that center line to the edges. And using a carefully scaled bounding box to derive the coordinates, I can render that gradient map. Nice, and then it's rinse and repeat for plants and flowers. For those assets, my workflow is essentially the same. The only difference here is that I probably want to use a specific color texture rather than rely on a splat map. So I use the texture painting mode to paint those meshes and quite easily render a diffuse texture. Alright, time to import that grass mesh. Turn off Generate Collision and Light Map, make sure Combine Meshes is turned on, and I will create a material myself, so I will turn that off. Then right click on that mesh and choose Add LOD1, import it, and do the same for LOD2. Cool, save it and open it. Here I'm going to add 2 material slots because I will probably want to apply a different, ideally cheaper material on those LODs. So select LOD1, assign it its corresponding material slot like so, and do the same for LOD2. Then I'm going to turn off shadow casting and collision for them all, and also make sure the default collision mode down there is correctly set up, because why not? Now, shadow casting grass sounds cool, but it's most often frowned upon. Shadow maps usually lack resolution to render decent shadows for very small and detailed assets like grass, and it's immensely expensive to render all those grass instances for each cascaded shadow map, so the cost is certainly quite high and the visual benefit is debatable. You may want to use screen space contact shadows though, it comes at a fixed cost based on the viewport resolution and contact shadow length, so it's kinda ideal for grass. But then it's a bit noisy, and usually for stylized grass at least, the general consensus is that non-shadow casting grass can look a bit more subtle and easy on the eye, so it's usually preferred, but you might disagree. Anyway, I also want to customize LOD distance for LOD 1 and 2. I'm going to eyeball those settings for now, but I will fine-tune them later on once I've grass instantiated on a landscape, and I can have a better grasp on what that screen percentage actually translates to in-game, right? Also don't forget to use this debug view, which is super useful to fine-tune LODs. Then I'm going to create a material and make 3 instances of it. One for LOD 0, LOD 1, and 2, and assign them here. Sweet! Last step is to import the grass textures, but that's straightforward enough. Just make sure RGB mask textures are set to well mask, and linear grayscale textures are also set to grayscale linear. And that's it for the base setup. Unreal Engine offers many ways to instantiate foliage. The Foliage tool is one, obviously. I can just drag that mesh here and then paint instances on any mesh that has collision enabled, including landscapes. It's quite straightforward. There are a few settings you might want to tweak here, but that's pretty much it. UE also comes with a complex procedural foliage tool with a bunch of rules to customize how assets can grow and also influence the growth of nearby assets and replicate lifelike behaviors. It's quite neat, but it's probably a bit much for most use cases, but feel free to take a look at it. A custom blueprint could also be used to, say, do a couple of vertical line traces here and there to find a valid ground and add instances to an instant static mesh component. This is quite a manual approach, it's not as straightforward as the Foliage tool for instance, and it has its limitations for sure, but it has its benefits as well, like really allowing you to build your own custom solution. Performance is going to be a concern though if you really need to process thousands and thousands of instances, so C++ might be the way to go to build proper custom tools. Also with UE 5.2 there's a new set of procedural tools that promise to do just that with node-based graphs, so that's really exciting. In this video, however, I'm going to focus on another solution, which is to instantiate grass using the landscape. So first I obviously need some kind of landscape, right, and have a material assigned to it. Then I need to create a landscape grass type asset, then add the grass mesh I just imported on any other, could be grass, flowers, trees, whatever, and here I'm just going to tweak the density to begin with. In that landscape material I can then add a grass output node and select the grass type asset I just created. A value of 1 is going to instantiate those foliage assets across the whole entire landscape, and 0 none. Instead of using a constant value though, I could choose to control where the grass is spawned using a landscape layer. So I'm going to create a landscape layer blend node with 2 layers, one named grass, one named dirt, and change the dirt layer blend type to hide blend. For now I'm not worried at all about the look, right? So say grass is still going to be that middle gray and dirt a darker gray. Hide dirt for now is going to be 05, but I'll use a texture later on. And then I'm going to sample that grass layer and plug that in the grass output node. Now I may need to reassign that material so those newly created landscape layers are detected by the landscape tool, and then assign a weight blended layer asset to each layer. If I then paint some dirt, you can see that grass instances disappear. Now it's based on a certain threshold value, right? It either spawns an instance or it doesn't, so it's not perfect, but I'll show some techniques to improve this in a minute. Also, you might have picked up on the grass disappearing in the distance, and that's due to the start and end cull distance setting you can tweak in the grass type, but I'll come back to that later on. It will play a huge role in keeping things performant, and I'm going to do a few bizarre things with this grass type asset as well. Alright, to keep the video somewhat short, I went ahead and worked a bit on the landscape material. As usual, I'd highly suggest working with material attributes, that way you can build materials one step at a time and keep material graphs super clean. So first, the base color is still just a layer blend between the grass and dirt layer. The grass layer has that splat map I mentioned earlier, applied using a word projection. The dirt layer is just a plain color because I didn't have time to do anything better. That being said, I used the first trick here, which is to sample that grass layer, apply some contrast and fall off to it, and use that to lerp between 2 dirt colors within the same dirt layer. That way I can sort of colorize the dirt around grass and create some kind of edge treatment. It's obviously quite subtle here, but you get the idea. Now you'd be tempted to add a sort of tiling grass texture on the grass layer, right? But personally I usually prefer to keep it super simple and rely on dense enough grass meshes to do the job. You might disagree and that's fine, but then in that case I would argue that one key thing is to get a consistent look between the grass ground texture and the grass meshes. And sometimes the most simple solution can do the job just good enough. Like say take some high resolution top-down screenshots here and there, then do some sort of collage, offset that image by half and paint over the seams, and voila, in a matter of minutes I've created a painterly looking tiling grass texture that perfectly matches the grass meshes look. Then I can convert it to grayscale to have some kinda sketchy height map that I can use to blend the grass and dirt layer. Moving on, specular and roughness are just constant values. Again, I want to keep the ground really simple. Lowering the specular from the default 0.5 value to almost 0 allows me to push the saturation quite a bit and have that flat painterly look. Also, quick side note, if your material is fully rough, you might consider enabling full roughness here to make the material a tiny bit cheaper. There's also always the option to disable decal response and make the material a bit cheaper as well if decals aren't your thing. Okay, so let's pick up the pace a little bit. I'm going to use Runtime virtual textures to do a few cool tricks on the grass, so I guess now is the time to set that up. You might dislike RVTs, I know a lot of people seem to experience flickering issues with them, amongst other problems, but honestly I'd say they are fine. Sure, they can be a bit finicky to work with, and you might indeed have flickering issues, but that's highly likely due to memory pools being full or things like that. So as usual, I can't help but recommend you to troubleshoot things, debug, tweak settings and so on, before hastily jumping to the conclusion that something is simply just not working. Anyway, so enable RVT in the project settings, then create 2 runtime virtual textures and set one of the 2 to world height. Then create 2 runtime virtual texture volumes, one volume should be assigned to the color RVT and the other assigned to the world height RVT. Then for both volumes, select the landscape and press set bounds. Then select the landscape, scroll down to the virtual texture panel and add the 2 RVTs. Last step, add a runtime virtual texture output node to the landscape material and wire the base color. Normals can just be the pixel normals in world space, and world height is, well, the Z world position. Now I don't really need to wire the specular and roughness because those are constant and I know which value I used, so that frees up 2 values I can use for something else. That being said, I could tweak this RVT setting and enable the mask channel, but that will increase the RVT memory cost by 25%, it's also more expensive to decode, and personally, although it should help with color accuracy and banding issues with gradients, I experienced quite the opposite. So I'm going to stick with the default mode and cheat a bit and use the specular channel to store the landscape grass layer mask. It's not ideal, it's usually best to avoid doing weird stuff like that can lead to a lot of confusion amongst artists working with you if you're on a production, but anyway, that will do for a YouTube video. Anyway, voila, now's the time to build the grass material. First I'm going to enable two-sided and switch blend mode to masked. Then for the base color, the same splat map I applied on the landscape with an extra color parameter will do just fine. Then I'm going to use that opacity texture rendered in Blender for the opacity mask, and same for specular and roughness. Now remember I said earlier that I was going to tweak normals directly in engine, so let's do that. I'm going to turn off tangent space normals, and so at that point this pin expects normals in world space. This means I can just use a Z unit vector, and voila, normals are all now pointing upwards. That's cool, but what if I want to use a normal map? Well, convert it from tangent to world space, and done. Just double check it's working as intended, so let's see, buffer visualization, world normals. That looks good to me, there's no difference with the front and back faces, so that's great. And to control the strength of that normal map, I can just lerp it with a Z unit vector, and voila. Okay, moving on, I'm going to switch the shading model to subsurface, and that's going to enable both the opacity and subsurface color pins. Opacity pretty much controls the SSS overall strength, and color well the color. And I'm going to be kinda lazy and just reuse the base color with a color multiplier for extra control, cheap and easy. Now for Stylized Grass, I'm really looking for a subtle smooth look, so now's the time to sample that runtime virtual texture and make that grass nicely blend with the landscape. So for now I'm simply going to replace the base color with a color sample from that RVT. I could do the same for specular and roughness, but remember I chose not to have them written in that RVT, because those are constant values, so I can just reuse them here. Feel free to do things differently. For the normal, well, I'm writing the landscape pixel normal in that RVT, so it's already in world space, and I can just use it as is, right? Because this material expects world space normals. At that point, the only difference with the landscape is that it has an opaque material and the grass has a subsurface material, and so that might give the grass a different look still, and it might not perfectly blend yet. So I'm going to ensure subsurface is entirely turned off where grass meets the ground, and to achieve that I'm going to use that normalized height I stored in UVs to make the material fully opaque at the roots, and also make sure the subsurface color is entirely black, that way the subsurface effect only shows on the tips. And voila, that grass now perfectly blends with the ground, nice. Now it looks really plain, so ideally I'd like some in between. I'd like for the grass to blend with the ground, sure, but also to have its own look. So let's lerp between the two and use that normalized height once again to blend between the ground material sample from that RVT at the roots and the grass material at the tips, and use a power to control the curvature of that root to tip gradient. The sky is the limit here. It would be possible, for instance, to use a texture projected in world space to also drive some kind of variation within that lerp and have some grass blend a bit more with the ground in some places and less in others, and bring some extra randomness to the picture. Okay, cool, we are making some decent progress, but that looks a bit dull still. And further down the rabbit hole we go. Alright, so here's where things get tricky. I'm going to do quite a bit of shenanigan here, so buckle up. I would also recommend you watching my candle breakdown video, where I also explain in depth a couple of similar world position offset techniques, so that might help, just in case I don't make any sense here. Anyway, I'd argue one of the most interesting techniques when it comes to world position offset is to reconstruct a world position from scratch and convert that position to an offset. So this is an offset, meaning whatever 3D offset I plug in here is going to be added to the vertice's initial position, right? Okay, what if I add an offset that is the inverse of that initial position? So world position multiplied by -1, or similarly, and I prefer this way, 0 subtracted by world position. and I'm also going to add a lerp so I can slowly fade in that world position offset. It's much more visual that way. Okay, that collapses all vertices to 0, 0, 0 in world space, so the mesh disappears. And that makes sense. If a given vertex is initially located in world space at say 500, 0, 0, and I offset it by minus 500, 0, 0, well, it ends up at 0, 0, 0, the world origin. And so essentially every single vertex position is nullified. And once I've done that, I can start building an entirely new world position one step at a time. For instance, instead of collapsing all vertices to 0, 0, 0, I could collapse them to, say, minus 100, 0, 0, right? So this here is a world position, which is converted to an offset, so that each vertex goes from their initial world position to that one. But collapsing vertices onto a single point somewhere in world space isn't any useful, we can all agree on that. So I'm going to use pre-skinned local position. This outputs the vertices raw position as stored in the mesh data. If it helps, you can picture that mesh opened in this editor window. It's in its own world, right? It sits at 0, 0, 0, it's not scaled, not rotated, nothing. It's a mesh as is, and pre-skinned local position outputs those vertices local position. So I can now make vertices move towards their local untransformed position, regardless of any transform applied on the object. And to better visualize what's going on, I'm going to make a copy of that grass mesh and assign it a flashy green material that has no world position offset at all, right, to represent that initial world position. And I'm going to make the material that has the world position offset, say, red. Now, just a quick reminder, world position offset is awesome, but as usual there's a catch. It's done on the GPU, so the CPU isn't aware of that offset, right? So it still quote-unquote thinks the mesh is here. That may cause a few issues. Collision, for instance, if that mesh has any, is not updated, so you'd still collide with the object at its initial position. The mesh might also disappear due to occlusion or frustum culling, meaning the CPU thinks that mesh is not in view anymore and thus decides to skip it. To fix this, you can trick the CPU into thinking the mesh is bigger than what it is, and delay that from happening, by increasing the mesh's bounds. But it's a bit of a hack obviously, and that comes with side effects, but that's an entire other topic. Also, world position offset may mess with distance fields, because those are pre-computed and not aware of any offset, so that may cause self-shadowing issues, which you can somewhat fix with that self-shadowing offset setting here. However, you don't usually have to be concerned too much about all that. It's rare that you apply an offset so intense that this kind of issues arise. Here it's really quite a drastic example. Alright, moving on. At this point you might still wonder what the heck I'm trying to do by moving vertices back to here. Well, again, the goal is to reconstruct the vertices world position, and the intent is that I'm going to reapply the object's transform one step at a time, location, rotation, scale, but also precisely choose and fine-tune how they are applied to achieve all kind of effects. Moving on, remember I baked those cards local X and Y pivot points in a second UV map, right? So in Engine I can simply get the second UV map to get those pivots, so texture coordinates index 1, and Z can just be 0, because those pivot points are really all at 0 in the object's local space. And I'm going to subtract this pivot point from that pre-skinned local position to essentially reconstruct a world position that is the mesh in local space, but without each card X and Y offset, and that's precisely what happens. See, all cards move back to 0, 0, 0. And that's super cool, because now that cards are all centered at 0, 0, 0, I can apply a scale and a rotation per card super easily. Let's start with the scale, so multiply that reconstructed world position by, I don't know, 0.5, and voila, cards are scaled by 0.5. Now that those cards are individually scaled, I could choose to add that pivot offset back, right? But instead of just adding it back as is, I'm going to transform it from local to world space. This means that whatever transform this object has is going to be applied to those pivot points. And so this object right now has this location. In other words, it's offset by that amount from the world origin, and thus that offset is going to be applied to those pivot points, and so vertices all end up here. Does that make sense? Now I have that 0.5 scale applied, so let's set it back to 1, and voila, I have reconstructed the initial vertices world position. But it's actually not quite right. It certainly matches the initial location, but a location is only one part of a transform. Let's have a look at what happens when I rotate the object. Let's do this on the reference object first, right? So say I apply a 30-degree rotation on that axis. Cool. Now let's do the same on the mesh, which vertices positions are reconstructed. Oh, that's interesting. It's somewhat rotating, right? The cards do seem to be located at the correct position, but they all remain straight. Well, that's actually to be expected, because if you think about it, nowhere in that world position offset logic do I say, hey, apply the object's rotation. This is the raw untransformed vertices positions, this is just an offset, this scale of 1 here actually does nothing, and this is also just an offset. There's no rotation. Now those pivot points are transformed from local to world space, meaning that object's rotation is applied to those pivot points, not vertices themselves. Thus why the grass cards all remain straight, but stick to their rotated pivot points. And that's awesome, because grass actually grows vertical and it looks much more natural than having grass glued to the landscape and growing sideways, which always triggers me for some reason. Okay, now pause for a second and try to foresee what's going to happen when I'm going to scale the object. So first I'm going to scale the reference object, just to have a, well, reference point, okay? Then ready? Did you guess right? The cards themselves do not scale, but they spread out. Because just like for the rotation, nowhere in that logic do I say, hey, apply that object scale, besides on the pivot points here with the local to world transform. So the cards spread out because those pivot points are scaled, not the vertices themselves. So I have a way to scale each card, they all remain straight, and I also have a way to spread them apart using the object scale. Cool. Now say that I actually want to truly apply the object scale on rotation. Well, using this local to world transform did precisely that, right? But I used it on the pivot points, so what if I use that same transform node, but on the vertices positions directly? Now this is where things can get really tricky, because there's a million ways to do this kind of world position reconstruction, and applying the object's location, rotation, scale, all in a different order, in a different way, so it's really quite unique per setup, right? So my only advice is to really picture where vertices are located in world space every single step of the way. Here, 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 and so on. That drastically helps figuring out where to apply a scale, or a rotation, or whatever. Here's an example. What if I move that transform node from that place to here? So again, it immensely helps to picture where vertices are in world space every step of the way. And at that point, cards are all centered at 0, 0, 0 in world space, right? So they can be scaled, and then pivots are added, this time in local space, so the cards spread apart once more, okay? And then the object's transform is applied, meaning the location, or the way I like to see it, the offset from the world origin, rotation and scale are all applied to those positions, and so vertices end up here. Yet I still can control the card scale, right? Second example, let's rewind back to having that transform node applied to those pivots. At this point I'm actually content with vertices position. Cards are actually positioned correctly in world space, right? I just need them to be rotated and scaled according to the object's rotation and scale. And yet I can't just apply that transform once more on the vertices. It would result in the object transform applied twice, once on the pivots and once on the vertices. To go around that, there's the transform vector node, which only applies rotation and scale. And when going from local to world space, you can think of the transform as a vector that you'd parent to the object, and that vector would rotate and scale according to it. But where to add that transform vector node? Well, you can picture a position as a vector going from 0, 0, 0 to that position. So a transform vector node applies scale and rotation around that world origin. So anything I want to scale or rotate need to have their pivot points centered at 0, 0, 0 first in world space. So to rotate and scale cards around their pivot point with that transform vector, they first all need to be centered at 0, 0, 0, which is precisely what happens here. So let's add that node here and see. Cards rotate and scale around that world origin according to the object's rotation and scale. And once that's done, it's safe to move cards to their pivot points in world space, and voila, I once again rebuild the fully transformed world position, yet I still have a way to scale each card. Now what if I just want to apply the object scale? Okay, get rid of the transform vector node. So I already have a way to control the scale here, right? So this would be the right place to apply the object scale. And UE has a node for that, but let's actually go through the effort of understanding how everything actually works. Okay, there's an X, Y and Z unit vector transformed from mesh particle space to world space. Now, mesh particle space sounds scary, and it has changed name in UE5, but really here you can pretend it's the same as the local space, okay? So again, that transform vector node from local to world space is really like having that vector parented to the object and matching its rotation and scale. Then that vector's length is computed, and by default, because this is at first a unit vector, it has a length of 1, right? And that regardless of any rotation applied. However, if the object is scaled by, say, a factor of 2 on the x-axis, the length of that x unit vector would now be 2, and that's how the object scale can be retrieved in materials. Now that distance check is a square root, so 3 square roots for all 3 axes, and really, assuming that my grass mesh is always going to be uniformly scaled, I can just check for one axis, say the z-axis, and use that for the x and y scale as well. It's a bit cheaper to compute. Let's double check that and see the cards now do scale with the object. And notice that if I don't respect my own constraint, meaning I scale the object in x or y, cards don't scale anymore because I'm only getting the object z scale to apply a uniform scale. Moving on, what if I just want to apply the object's rotation? That's when matrices come into play. It may sound scary, but it's actually not that bad. So same constraint here, I can't just randomly apply a transform matrix. I want cards to be rotated around their own pivot point. So just like with the transform vector node, this transform matrix needs to happen when cards have their pivot point centered at 0, 0, 0 in world space. So here. And a rotation matrix is really like saying, hey mate, you know that coordinate system of yours, those x, y and z axis? Well, I'm going to have those axes oriented differently and you're going to rotate accordingly. So let's do that. Let's say to that vector, hey, your x, y and z axis are now the object's x, y and z axis. How do I do that? Well, you should have the answer by now. Feel free to pause the video and think about it for a second. Alright, if transforming an x unit vector from local to world space applies that object's rotation and scale, all I have to do is to get rid of that scale. So just normalize the resulting vector to scale it back to 1, and that results in the object's rotated x-axis. And so do that for the x, y and z axis, and voila, cards rotate based on the object's rotation. So you see the sky is the limit here. You can do quite a few insane tricks with this world position reconstruction approach once you have a good grasp on vector math and transforms. It sure is confusing at first, but with some practice it eventually makes a lot of sense. Now that's out of the way, let's see what can be done with this. I'll stick with scale and come back to rotation later on to explain my custom billboard method. I'm first going to sample a texture projected in world space as a way to control that scale value and vary the grass card scale across the landscape. Now that may induce some distortion because say a vertex around here samples a texture at a slightly different world position than a vertex around there, and so the resulting scale may vary slightly. To go around that, there's a trick I like to use, which is to rely on the pivots in world space as a coordinate to sample that texture. That way the value sampled from that texture is somewhat unified across all vertices on the same card, right? And that prevents distortion. Cool, that allows me to have grass of varying height, which looks a bit more natural, but there's so much more I can do. I can, for instance, make use of that PerInstanceFade amount node to scale cards down to 0 at a distance and have them smoothly fade away. This PerInstanceFade amount, by the way, is a value that ramps up from 0 based on that start call distance setting to 1 based on, you guessed it, that end call distance. It's a range you can tweak in any tool that makes use of instances, so grass type obviously, but also the foliage tool or even an instance static mesh component. Okay, sweet, now cards smoothly fade away at a distance before being culled rather than abruptly disappear. I can go even further and sample the landscape grass layer, which I stored in the specular channel of that RVT, remember, and shrink cards if some happen to bleed on the dirt layer. That helps tie everything together a bit more nicely. Speaking of RVTs, there's a bunch of tricks you can do. For instance, I could use a plane and configure it to be invisible in the main path, yet draw its material in that RVT. And that material could, say, based on some kind of opacity texture, write 0 into that specular channel. and then as long as this plane is within the runtime virtual texture bounds and on top of the landscape, it would write that 0 value in the specular channel of that RVT, which I use to control the grass card scale, and that would allow me to shrink grass cards at an arbitrary location. Same for color, I could override the RVT and literally paint on it to vary the grass color here and there. Okay, another common trick is to tilt grass cards based on the camera angle, so that when you look down, you just don't see straight through paper thin cards. To achieve this, no need to apply a rotation, a simple offset applied to the top vertices does the trick well enough, like what this material function does. So first, transform a Y unit vector from view space to world space. That's like saying, hey, parent an arrow pointing upward to the camera and get me its world direction. And so when looking down, that arrow's X and Y components increase, and the resulting 2D vector can be used to push vertices forward in camera space the more we look down. Now it's the X and Y components of a unit vector, so it needs to be scaled somewhat to actually offset vertices, right? And simply enough, that 2D vector can be multiplied by the mesh local height to convert that offset into a tilt angle. Meaning a vertex at, say, 1 unit high will be at most pushed 1 unit forward when looking straight down, and one at 100 units high will be pushed 100 units forward, so you get a 45-degree tilt. And that's one way to help hide that ugly paper-thin grass cards look when looking down. Although it's a bit of a hack, right? That effect might be quite apparent and might even push vertices inside nearby meshes, so you might either want to keep it subtle or choose another approach. Another common issue you might want to solve is view occlusion, because it can be quite annoying to have the view hidden by grass blades right in front of the camera. And there's many solutions to this. You might want to use Dithered opacity and use pixel depth to drive the opacity mass value and somewhat smoothly fade in and out that grass that is too close to the camera. Dithered opacity comes at a small cost though, and you might not like the look of it. So another solution I like is to use some kind of distance field texture. Remember that texture I mentioned earlier? That's where it comes into play. That gradient texture can be used to smoothly offset the opacity mask value based on pixel depth and have each grass blade smoothly fade in and out. And you can use that technique to drive the thickness or scale of your grass or even leaves on a tree. It's quite a common trick actually to create seasonal effects and have leaves slowly shrink and disappear during winter or something. It's also possible to rely on a world position offset rather than opacity to push vertices away from the camera and create a sort of custom camera collision logic. And this material function does precisely that. You could go with a much simpler and cheaper setup, but I like the control this particular method gives me. So first, compute the position delta between the vertices and the camera's position. A dot product of that delta vector itself outputs its squared length. This avoids the square root, and I don't actually care about the actual real distance. I just want to build a distance gradient, which I do here, using first an offset, if desired, and a divide to create a 0 to 1 gradient. Again, I'm working with a squared length here, so the offset and distance divisor must be squared as well for the math to make sense. Then saturate to actually clamp that range between 0 and 1, and then a 1 minus to flip it, because I want vertices to be offset the closer they are to the camera, so when length is 0, I want a value of 1. Then apply some fall-off to control how fast that gradient ramps up from 0 to 1. It will have some fall-off anyway, even without that power, because I'm using a squared length, so that already gives some kind of weight to the distance gradient. It's not linear by default, but I don't mind. Then multiply that value by the mesh's local z height, so that the offset is sort of converted to a tilt, like I explained earlier. So that's the overall multiplier value that controls the strength of that camera avoidance effect, okay? The offset itself is computed here. First use that same position delta and do a dot product with the next unit vector, transform from view to world space. Again, this is like saying, hey, parent an arrow pointing that way to the camera and get me its world direction as the camera moves around. And the dot product between the delta position and that direction outputs the distance of that vector along that axis. However, that's just a scalar value, a distance, right? So multiply that distance by that unit vector to actually end up with that vector. And that corresponds to how left and right a vertex is to the middle of the screen. multiplied by some amount, and that results in a lateral or sideways push. Then here I use a z-vector transformed from view to world space. A z-vector relative to the camera is, in Unreal Engine, a vector pointing forward in view space, and so once converted to world space, it can be used to push vertices well forward. Then add those forward and sideways vectors. I discard the z component though, which is replaced by a simple negative z value. And voila, that setup let me control how much grass is pushed forward, sideways, and downward along the grass height. You could use a normalized height to apply a fall-off to have the grass bend with some curvature rather than being pushed linearly, right? But then it might prevent some vertices to be pushed away enough from the camera, and that might result in some clipping, which I would argue is the purpose of this function in the first place, so I prefer to keep that offset linear. Now, one trick I didn't mention: to compute the delta position, you typically use the vertex world position and the camera's position, right? But that may result in some stretching. For instance, this vertex may not be as distant to the camera as, say, that one, so this logic might not push this vertex away from the camera as much as that one, so the grass might collapse on itself or stretch a bit in some places. To prevent that, I like to compute the delta position using the grass card's pivot points in world space. That way, that squared length is no longer computed per vertex, but per card, so this entire math logic is, say, unified for an entire grass card, and the push effect is consistent across all vertices on a same card, and that prevents stretch and so on. Alright, wind animation. Game studios often come up with quite intricate solutions to build unified wind systems, and that ain't as easy as it sounds. It's a very complicated topic, especially for grass. If you want to have full control over the wind, like the quote-unquote shape of the wind blowing across the landscape, its direction and amplitude, there are quite a few complications to deal with, and I'll for sure keep things simple here. I'll let you take a look at this great GDC talk to understand what I'm talking about, and actually shout out to this GDC speaker for mentioning a technique I fell in love with, the one I'm about to explain. To give you some context, I too often see this node being used to create cheap wind animation, even in AAA games. There's nothing wrong with it really, but the motion it creates is so easily recognizable. I see it everywhere, and hopefully the solution I'm going to explain will incite you to try other methods. Because it's actually quite easy to set up. It doesn't even need pivot points, so you don't even need to bake pivots for your grass meshes for this technique to work. I'm mentioning pivots because a lot of people, me included, rely on them to apply a rotation in order to build much more intricate wind effects than this kind of simple offset-based wind motion, right? And it usually looks great, but it can be expensive-ish to compute for a lot of vertices, due to the trigonometry involved to compute that rotation. You see, a sine or cosine isn't as straightforward for your GPU to compute as, say, a simple add or multiply, right? And so there's actually a technique to approximate a rotation, emphasize on approximate. Although optimization is one thing, and really at this point it's more of a micro-optimization. Don't expect any drastic FPS gain using this approximation method, right? It's even not guaranteed to be more performant than using actual rotations. However, in my opinion, one benefit of this technique is also regarding the workflow involved. Rotation requires pivots to be baked, and that might not be a solution for you, for whatever reason. And also, when working with rotations, well, you have to compute both an axis and an angle. It certainly isn't the end of the world, but when you just want to get grass moving, that can be extra work you'd gladly skip. Okay, so the idea is pretty straightforward. Here I have a grass card with a bunch of vertices, right? So first, take any vertex and get its vertical distance to the object's pivot point. Then assume some kind of 2D wind offset is applied in X and Y. That would just offset the entire grass card in X and Y, right? So that offset is multiplied by the normalized grass card height. Better, but that results in a stretch, and that doesn't look like the grass card is rotating at all. Alright, so then compute the distance from that vertex with the offset applied to this point, and then push this vertex towards that point by how much this distance is greater than that one, and that's what you may call a spherical reprojection, and that mimics a rotation. Now, the issue with this approach is that it deforms the mesh. Imagine a quad. Offsetting the top vertices and applying that spherical reprojection is going to shrink that quad the greater the offset, because of that spherical reprojection. But again, if you keep that offset under control, for grass at least, it's barely noticeable. Okay, so let's take a look at what it looks like in a material function. First, get that vertex initial vertical distance to the object's pivot point, and for that grass mesh, it's as easy as getting the vertex Z position in local space. That's the initial distance we want to maintain, right? Then add the wind offset, compute the 3D distance, and compare the two. That's the length we need to add or remove in that direction. And so get that direction with a normalize multiplied by that distance delta, and that's the correction offset to apply. And that's pretty much it. It's super cheap, there's 2 square roots and that's it. Now again, I don't want to emphasize on the performance too much. It's really micro optimization at this point, but I see 2 other benefits with this technique. Again, to add wind motion, I find it much more straightforward to deal with offsets rather than having to deal with a rotation axis and an angle, right? Second, that reprojection direction can be used as a new normal in world space. And voila, normals are somewhat fixed. It's not perfect at the pivots, but it's pretty much free, so can't complain. Anyway, once that material function is built, it's quite straightforward to add interesting wind motion. Back in Blender, I baked 2 tiling normal maps using the Ocean modifier. Feel free to have a look at my last video to have more info on that process. I'm only interested in the X and Y channels though, because again, wind is going to be added as a simple 2D offset, so I can actually pack 2 wind maps in one. One for the low frequency wind with large smooth gradients packed in the red and green channels, and one for the high frequency wind with much more noise packed in the blue and alpha channel. Then in Engine, I project that texture in world space and scroll it using time multiplied by some speed in X and Y. That time, however, is offset randomly per grass instance using the per instance random value, but also per card within each instance using that pseudo-random value I stored in UVs, right? And that let me control if I want a very chaotic looking wind with every single card having its own wind animation time, or a very unified looking wind, if you may, with no random offset applied at all. I also offset time along the grass length, and that results in that wind texture having some delay along that length and this swirling effect. And so the resulting 2D offset is sent to that Spherical Reprojection material function, and I also output the low and high frequency wind amplitude that I use to boost a tiny bit the base color and emphasize that wind with some extra brightness and color. Another small trick you might want to try is a depth offset. See these flowers and plants, they get lost somewhat within the grass, especially at a distance. And so to increase their visibility, I cheat and offset vertices towards the camera a little bit. It's done by computing the delta position between a vertex and the camera's position, divided by how far that vertex is to the camera on the camera's forward axis, multiplied by some amount to push that vertex towards the camera. Also, it's probably a good idea to turn that offset off when shadows are rendered. Cool. Continuing with even more world position offset techniques, and this one has many names within the industry: ground hugging, ground projection, whatever. It ensures proper contact with the ground. You see that grass mesh being quite a large model, some grass cards might levitate or clip through the ground a bit due to the varying slope, because that grass instance itself is properly positioned on the landscape, not the individual grass cards. So the idea here is to sample the ground height and move vertices up and down as needed. And there are many ways to do this. The most straightforward solution, I think, is to sample that landscape height at a given vertex world position, subtract that vertex current Z position to it, that's going to flatten the mesh onto the ground, right? And then add that initial mesh Z local height back. You might have to take the object scale and all into account here, but you know the deal by now. And that results in a Z vertical offset to apply to have that grass mesh flushed against the ground. Sweet, however it's not perfect because it's highly dependent on that RVT resolution. The bigger the landscape, the more approximate this world height value is, unless you toy with that RVT texture settings to increase the resolution and all, but that's not free obviously, so yeah. Also, landscape LODs seem to behave a bit weirdly with RVTs, so you might want to add a bias to it. Speaking of hacks, I tried something new with this project. The idea was to create clumps of grass. I kinda failed, honestly, but just in case it gives you ideas, let me show you. I first created this blobby looking tiling texture in Krita, then used it as a displacement map in Blender to bake a tiling normal map. I'm only interested in its X and Y components though. That texture is then projected in engine in world space just before that spherical reprojection is applied to simply offset vertices and create those kind of grass clumps with some kind of fixed direction baked in. And because that spherical reprojection outputs the fixed world normal vector, that what I call Clump Map also produces varying normal patterns across the grass, and that helps vary how the grass reacts to lighting, and it brings some randomness to the picture. It's not great, it may not look supernatural, and you might just not like the look of it. I don't necessarily either, so I kept the effect quite subtle. There's surely a bit more work to be done here to find a proper solution. One thing I have in mind, for instance, is that here I reconstruct world positions from scratch, right? So I move cards to where they need to be based on their pivot points in world space. But I could somewhat also move them around arbitrarily using some kind of maybe density map or something and vary the grass density across the landscape. With that ground projection method, any card offset too much would still make proper contact with the ground, so I'm kinda free to move cards around, so I bet there's things to try here. Alright, fine-tuning every techniques I showcased results in that kind of look, which I kinda like. However, I'm not really happy with the draw distance, so I can increase the ankle distance setting, right? But that gets expensive real fast, and even though I have two LODs set up for the grass model, drawing that many grass instances absolutely murders my FPS. And having profiled this, the performance bottleneck I experience here is 100% due to the vertex count, not the transparency or anything else. So I spent quite some time investigating different solutions, and I eventually ended up going with a custom billboard approach. Back in Blender, I modeled 3 large clumps of grass and detoured that first clump with a single quad to create a simple billboard mesh. I also unwrapped it using the same technique I explained earlier on, and you'll see in a minute why I modeled 3 clumps and why that quad is UV'd to only map the first one. Then in engine, I'm going to create a material that turns this quad into a billboard, and if you watched my candle breakdown video, you probably know where this is going. Yes, transform matrices once more. You should know by now that a z-vector relative to the camera in an Unreal Engine is a vector pointing forward, and so a negative z-vector is one that points towards the camera. That means that if a mesh faces negative z, well, it's like it faces the camera if the camera is in its default orientation, and so a simple view-to-world transform on that mesh vertices in local space then applies any rotation the camera may have, and so the mesh always faces the camera. However, what if, for whatever reason, that mesh doesn't face negative z in the first place, like it's the case here? Well, it would still orient itself towards the camera at all time, but with whatever orientation it has at first, right? And so to correctly reorient the mesh, you guessed it, I can apply a very simple transform matrix and say, hey, vector, you don't need to change your x-axis, but please flip those y and z axes of yours. That's going to make that billboard face negative z, see? And now that it matches the camera coordinate system, I can apply that view toward space transform. Sweet, Houston, we have a billboard. Okay, great, but actually it's not that great, because it sure faces the camera, but it now kinda clips through the landscape if there's any kind of slope. So ideally I'd want some sort of billboard that would maintain the object's up axis. And transform matrices to the rescue once again, I'm going to delete that node and make that mesh face the camera myself with another transform matrix. This time I'm going to say, hey vector, your z-axis is now that z-axis in view space, so a vector pointing forward in camera space, right? However, your y-axis isn't going to be a y-axis in view space, but the z-axis in the mesh's local space. And your x-axis is going to be derived from those two, using a cross product. Now, I only want that transform matrix to apply a rotation, and if you followed along, you should have guessed that I need to get rid of any scale that may be applied with that local to world transform, and so I need to normalize it and the resulting cross product as well. I don't care about the z-axis in view space though, because that billboard is just a card without any thickness, and it sits at 0, 0, 0 in local space, so it can be scaled along that axis, it won't result in any change, and so that let me skip a square root. Awesome, I now have a billboard that faces towards the camera but keeps its own up-axis. However, that might prove to be an issue if that billboard is on a slope, because sure it doesn't clip through the landscape anymore, but there are two issues. One, if I look at those cards from above, well, it doesn't look too great. Two, I worked quite hard to ensure that my grass cards remain straight regardless of the slope, right? Now, the ladder might not be such an issue for distant grass, however I'm quite concerned about how different this billboard grass may look from the quote-unquote normal grass. The transition between the two is probably going to be quite noticeable if one looks quite different from the other. To fix this, I came up with a very simple hack, which is to revert to using that first billboard method, but only on the top vertices. That way the bottom vertices do maintain proper ground contact and doesn't clip through the landscape, and the top vertices remain horizontal, yet tilt towards the camera. That induces some stretching, sure, but it's not that visible at a distance, and it looks way more similar to the normal grass that way. Sweet, now let's add that billboard as an extra LOD. Okay, that's great, I can push the ankle distance quite a bit and performance remains actually decent, but I actually have many concerns with this approach. First, well, that LOD transition is quite noticeable, right? I could use Dithered LOD transition to help a bit here, but it comes at a cost and doesn't magically solve the issue, and that's actually the least of my concerns anyway. My biggest issue is that whatever density value I set for the grass here not only controls the normal grass, but also the distant grass, and I probably want to fine-tune density for both separately. Not only that, but the rest of these settings here as well, right? I may want to use some grid shader for the normal grass and none for the billboards to ensure uniform distribution or something, so it's quite constraining. Alright, so I'm going to get rid of that LOD and I will let that normal grass fade away at a medium distance, it's fine. Next I'm going to spawn grass billboards separately using another grass variety and tweak the density and start and ankle distances so those only fade away at a large distance. Okay, however grass billboards now spawn up close as well and they don't look too good at that distance. Well, if I can use that PerInstanceFade amount to smoothly scale cards to 0 at a distance, I can do the same but in reverse. Meaning compute how distant a card is to the camera on its forward axis and create a normalized 0 to 1 gradient, like I've done a million times by now, and fine-tune the offset and distance, so those billboard cards are scaled to 0 in the distance, but up close as well, right until that medium distance grass starts to scale down, right? I'm looking to build a smooth transition between the two, like so. Awesome, now that billboard grass do look quite a bit different, but one, it's incredibly cheap to render and I can draw grass up to 1 kilometer away without a sweat now, and two, the transition is kinda butter smooth, so it isn't much of a concern, to me at least. You might think differently, in that case, well, you're on your own. Feel free to iterate on the idea and come up with a better solution. Now, that distant grass sure looks quite uniform, so what I can do is use that per instance random value to randomly select one of the 3 grass clumps to sample, kinda like a flipbook. And that's simple enough. The idea is to shift UV the next by either 1/3 or 2/3 randomly, and this does precisely that. And voila, that adds quite some variation. It sure isn't perfect still, especially with an aerial view, but I'd say it somewhat holds up, and that kind of view is always going to be tricky to deal with anyway, both in terms of look and performance. Cool, now the very last thing I want to improve is the grass density up close. Well, why not use a 3rd grass variety? This grass type instancing system seems to be quite performant, so why not leverage it, right? So let's add one more variety, much more dense, but let's scale it at a somewhat small distance. And thanks to that scaling technique, that dense grass fades away quite smoothly, and the extra grass density up close is certainly appreciable. I might even want to reduce the medium distance grass density slightly to boost performance a bit. And there it is, I have quite a dense grass up close, a decently dense grass at a medium distance, and just enough grass billboards at an even greater distance to look decent enough. They all transition from one to the other quite smoothly, and it's immensely performant. Around 110 FPS on 10 years old hardware, so that's not bad considering it looks somewhat decent. Fine-tuning the grass density played a huge role in maximizing performance, the start and ankle distance settings as well obviously, and the LOD distance for the normal grass mesh played a more modest role as well. Fine-tuning the grass material per LOD did also help a bit, and to achieve that I created a master foliage material that can be used for grass, plants, flowers, with tons of parameter switches to enable or disable pretty much every feature. And so some features were disabled on LODs, like say ground projection might not be needed in the distance, that view occlusion fade trick as well obviously, maybe even sampling the normal, roughness or specular map could be turned off at a distance if it doesn't contribute much to the end result. Just be careful with that LOD transition, right? Don't introduce too much change from one LOD to the next. Anyway, let's complete this scene and use the foliage tool to spawn some flowers and plants. Neat. Voila, I think that's all. This was quite a journey, congrats if you made it this far. This video took me forever to do, holy cow, it definitely ended up quite a bit longer than I first envisioned, but then I did my best to explain everything as much as I could, so yeah, hopefully most of it made sense. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you like the content, that always help. Also, if you want to support me and want to see more videos like this one, you're more than welcome to join my Patreon. You'll get access to my Discord and all kind of great UE projects. This particular one, for instance, is available as a tier 2 reward, so yeah, feel free to check it out. I wouldn't be able to make those kind of videos if it weren't for my Patreon supporters, and thanks to all of you who do support me on Patreon, big props to you. Alright, that's it, thanks so much for watching, I'll see you in the next video, take care of yourself, bye bye!